You ever spend years living next to someone, eating breakfast with them, sleeping beside them, thinking you know every line on their face, only to realize one night that you've been sleeping next to a stranger the whole damn time? Because that's exactly what hit me the moment I heard my husband whisper my name in the dark like he was scared of his own shadow. And let me tell you something. When a man who's been calm his whole life suddenly sounds terrified, your ears don't just perk up. They reach. They stretch. They search for anything that makes sense. That night was quiet. The kind of quiet you get only in small American towns after 11 p.m., when the streetlights hum louder than the neighbors. I was sitting in our old Pennsylvania living room, the one that still smelled faintly of lemon polish and last night's coffee, trying to finish a crossword before bed. Then I heard it, a soft, hollow thump coming from our basement. Not loud enough to be an accident. Just loud enough to feel intentional. My husband, Tom, paused on the staircase like someone had pressed a hand to his chest. His face went pale, the way a person goes when a memory hits them harder than the present. 20 years together, and I had never seen that look. Not once. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, but it wasn't a question. It was a confession. A slip. A crack. And as he stood there frozen, eyes on the basement door like something down there was calling his name, I felt a sharp, unfamiliar truth press into me. This wasn't fear of the sound. This was fear of the past. The thump came again. Small, dull, like something shifting under old boxes, and he flinched so hard he had to grab the railing. That's when my stomach dropped. Because a man doesn't react like that to a basement unless there's something down there he hoped would stay buried. And for the first time in 20 years of marriage, I realized I wasn't just hearing a noise. I was hearing the beginning of the truth he'd spent half his life hiding. What kind of secret shakes a grown man like that? And why did he look at me like he was terrified I'd figure it out? That was the night everything started cracking open. You ever look back at the moment you met someone and think, damn, the warning signs were there, I just didn't have the eyes for them yet? Because when I first met Tom back in '99, he was the last man on earth you'd expect to be carrying anything darker than overdue bills. I was 36, working the front desk at a small dental clinic in Scranton, still trying to stitch my life together after a rough divorce. He walked in one rainy Thursday, plain jeans, steel-toed work boots, a steady kind of smile you don't question. The kind older women trust instantly. And I trusted too easily back then. He told me he grew up in a mill town about 40 minutes south, the kind where everybody knows your parents and your past. But every time I asked about his teenage years, he'd brush it off like the whole chapter was water-damaged and unreadable. Back then, I figured he was just private. Lord, the lies we tell ourselves to keep the peace. Even in our first apartment together, a small two-bedroom near the Lackawanna River with peeling cabinets and carpet that never stopped shedding, he had these odd boundaries. Wouldn't watch the local news. Never drove south toward his hometown unless he absolutely had to. Flinched when he heard sirens, even if they were miles away. I used to laugh it off, thinking he was just the anxious type. But as the years went on, those little quirks didn't fade. They deepened, hardened, built themselves into habits that felt less like preferences and more like defense mechanisms. And the strangest thing, he never kept souvenirs from his past. No high school pictures, no baseball trophies, no childhood stories except the generic kind you find in Hallmark movies. The only thing he guarded like treasure was an old metal toolbox, something he never let me touch, not even to move it during spring cleaning. "Some things are just mine," he'd say with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. At the time, I thought that was fair. After all, every marriage leaves a little room for privacy, right? But standing there that night after the basement noise, watching him stare at that old toolbox like it was a ticking bomb, I finally understood the truth I'd been avoiding for 20 damn years. Tom didn't have a past. He had a crime scene. And every lie he told me was just one more brick in the wall he'd built to keep it hidden. The worst part, I hadn't even found the first crack in that wall yet, but I was about to. Funny how a life can start unraveling from something as small and stupid as a piece of old paper. You spend years thinking the truth, real truth, comes dressed like some dramatic moment, some confession, some showdown. But no. Mine came when I was reaching into Tom's old metal toolbox looking for a damn screwdriver because the kitchen drawer kept sticking. He wasn't home that afternoon. He was out helping a neighbor fix a fence. So I opened the lid without thinking, expecting the usual tangle of wrenches and rusted nails. Instead, something thin fluttered out and landed on the floor, this yellowed, brittle newspaper clipping. At first, I thought it was just another one of his strange keepsakes. But then I read the headline. Local man missing near river. Foul play suspected. My stomach tightened as I scanned the date. It was from the summer of '79, 20 years before I met Tom. The same town he never talked about. The same river he wouldn't drive past. The article mentioned a young man named Kevin Mallory, 19, last seen leaving a party near the old steel bridge. Last person to see him alive? A group of local boys, the article said, unnamed. No details. No follow-up. Just enough to pull a thread. When Tom came home, sweaty from the sun and smelling like cedar and engine grease, I held up the clipping and asked, "What's this?" I swear to God, he froze. Not blinked. Not paused. Froze, like I'd just handed him a piece of his own obituary. His face drained so fast it scared me. And then he said it, too fast, too sharp, too rehearsed. I don't know that guy. Must have been tucked in there from the hardware shop or something. Hardware shop. Come on. That lie cracked before it even left his mouth. His hands were shaking when he reached for the clipping. Not the kind of shake you get from a long day. No, this was something deeper. Older. Buried. And as he stuffed that clipping back into the box like it was radioactive, something inside me shifted. A whisper. A warning. A question I didn't have the courage to say out loud yet. Why the hell did you keep that? From that moment, the air between us felt different. Thicker, heavier, crowded with 20 years of things I suddenly realized he'd never told me. That little clipping shouldn't have meant anything. But I felt it in my bones. It was the first breadcrumb on a trail he never wanted me to follow. And whether I meant to or not, I'd already started walking. You ever hear a phone ring and feel, deep in your gut, that whatever's on the other end isn't meant for your ears, but it's about to change your whole damn life anyway? Because that's exactly how it felt the night our landline buzzed at 8:43 p.m., a time when nobody calls unless something's wrong. I was folding laundry on the couch, the TV humming low with some rerun, when Tom picked up the phone. And the second he heard the voice, his whole posture collapsed. Not a slump. No, it was like someone knocked the breath out of him. I couldn't hear the whole conversation, but I caught enough to feel the blood drain from my face. The man introduced himself. Detective Rowan, Lackawanna County. That was the first red flag. Nobody from his hometown ever called. Nobody from his hometown ever should have called. Tom stepped into the hallway, lowering his voice, but our walls were thin and fear has a way of making everything louder. I heard fragments, new information. Old case. Someone talking again, and then the word that made Tom grip the phone so hard his knuckles went white. River. That damn river again. The same one from the clipping. The same one he'd refused to drive near for as long as I'd known him. I walked toward the hallway just as Tom said, voice shaking, "I told you everything back then. There's nothing new. Back then. Everything. Nothing new." My heart hammered in my ears. I stood just out of sight, holding my breath like a scared kid listening at a bedroom door. The detective's voice grew sharper, more insistent, and Tom finally snapped, "Don't call here again," and slammed the phone down. For a moment, he just stood there in the hallway, chest rising and falling like he'd run a mile. When he turned and saw me watching him, his expression hardened, not angry, not scared, guarded. Like he was locking the door to a room he prayed I'd never open. "Wrong number," he muttered. "Wrong number." A detective asking about a river was a wrong number? Please. Even if I wanted to believe him, my brain wouldn't let me. It was connecting dots faster than I could breathe. The clipping, the reaction, the river, the secrecy. And now a detective calling 2 decades later about a case he claimed he told everything about. I swear, something cold crawled through me in that moment. Not fear of him, but fear of the truth. Because lies don't usually come back after 20 years. Unless someone, somewhere, is finally ready to tell the real story. That night, I didn't ask questions. But I started watching, listening, taking mental notes of every twitch, every shift, every time he avoided eye contact when the news mentioned old cases or cold files. And lying there in bed beside him, staring at the ceiling while he tossed and turned like a man haunted, I realized something terrifying. My husband wasn't living in the present anymore. He was living in the long shadow of something he'd done 20 years earlier, something the river never forgot. And whatever Detective Rowan wanted to tell him was only the beginning. You ever sit across from someone you love and realize the drink in their hand is the only thing keeping the truth from clawing its way out of their throat? Because 2 nights after that phone call, that was Tom, sitting at our small oak kitchen table with a half-empty bottle of cheap bourbon, staring into it like maybe the past was floating somewhere at the bottom. He wasn't a heavy drinker. Hell, some months he didn't touch alcohol at all. But that night, he poured glass after glass like he was trying to drown something older than both of us. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the wall clock, and I swear, with every tick, he looked 10 years older. His shoulders sagged, his hands trembled, and the air around him felt defeated. Finally, he said my name, not the usual warm Mary, but a hollow version, like he was calling me from a long distance. I did something stupid when I was a kid, he muttered. His voice was thick, shaky. I didn't breathe, didn't blink, didn't move. Just waited. He kept talking, stumbling through his words like they were shards of glass in his mouth. It was a party near the bridge. Summer of '79. Couple of us boys got into it with another kid. Kevin. He mouthed off. Things got out of hand. Out of hand. Jesus. That phrase has sent more men to prison than fistfights ever have. He rubbed his face, palms dragging down like they were weighted. I didn't mean for anything bad to happen. We were just stupid. Young. Showing off. He slipped near the riverbank and… He didn't finish. Couldn't. The silence after that said more than he ever could. My heart felt like it was twisting itself into knots, but I kept my voice steady. And what, Tom? He swallowed hard and whispered, "It was an accident." Except it didn't sound like a man defending himself. It sounded like a man begging someone, anyone, to let him believe his own lie for one more night. I looked at him, really looked, and saw something I'd never seen in 20 years. Terror. Deep, bone-level terror. Not of the law. Not of consequences. But of the truth catching up. He leaned back in his chair and said, "I thought he'd get up. I thought." Then he cut himself off, shaking his head violently, like he'd said too much. "It's been handled. It was nothing. It was boys being stupid." Boys being stupid doesn't leave a missing person on a newspaper clipping. Boys being stupid don't get calls from detectives 4 decades later. Boys being stupid don't go pale when someone mentions a river. I sat there in silence, trying to breathe around the fact that the man I married wasn't who I thought he was, and maybe never had been. And as he pushed the bottle away and stared at his trembling hands, I realized something that made my stomach turn. He wasn't telling me the truth. He was telling me the smallest, safest piece of it. The real story, the one he'd been burying since 1979, was still locked behind his eyes. And now that the first crack was open, it was only a matter of time before the rest broke wide open. You ever follow a gut feeling so strong it feels less like instinct and more like someone tapping you on the back of the neck, telling you, "Look again, you missed something"? Because after Tom's half-truth of a confession, that feeling wouldn't leave me alone. It followed me through every room of the house, whispering in the quiet moments, poking me awake at night. And finally, one Thursday morning, I did something I'd never done in 20 years of marriage. I drove to his hometown without telling him. The place hadn't changed much. Still the same tired mill town tucked along the river, where the houses leaned into each other like old men swapping gossip. It smelled like wet leaves and rust, and the whole drive-in, I kept thinking, this is the place he tried to erase. I parked outside a diner that looked like it had been there since Eisenhower, the kind of place where locals drink the same coffee at the same tables every morning. And when I mentioned Kevin Mallory's name, casually, like I was asking about a high school reunion, the whole damn room shifted. Not dramatically, not obviously, just a quiet tightening, like someone had pulled a thread through the air. The waitress, an older woman with silver curls and a voice like gravel, froze mid-pour and gave me this long, knowing look. "You knew Kevin?" she asked. "No," I said. "My husband grew up around here. I was just curious." She studied me for a beat too long, then sighed. "That boy had trouble written all over him, but he didn't deserve what happened." What happened? Not what might have happened. Not what people think happened. And that phrasing hit me like a cold slap. When I hesitated, she leaned in a little, lowering her voice. Kevin was mixed up with the wrong crowd. Boys who drank too much, fought too quick, and thought the river washed everything clean. I swear my fingers went numb, because I knew exactly who she meant. And then she added the detail that turned everything inside out. "You should talk to Clara. She was Kevin's girl. Still lives nearby. Still thinks those boys know more than they said. Kevin had a girlfriend. A real person. A real witness. A real story that wasn't in that clipped article." And something in the waitress's face made my stomach twist. "What did she think happened?" I asked. The woman shrugged, but her eyes stayed sharp. "Jealousy. That's what she always said. Boys get jealous, one thing leads to another. Next thing you know, someone's in the river." Jealousy. A motive. The one word Tom had never mentioned. On the drive home, every mile felt heavier than the last. Because now I wasn't holding just suspicion, I was holding context. Connections. A shape forming around the truth he'd tried to bury. And by the time I pulled into our driveway, I knew something with an awful, sinking certainty. Tom didn't just have a dark past. He had a past with a motive. And that meant the story he gave me, the accident, the boys being stupid, was still only half the damn truth. Worse, I had a feeling the woman named Clara knew the other half. You ever have a moment where the air in the room changes so fast it feels like you stepped into someone else's life, someone else's nightmare? That was me 3 days after I visited Tom's hometown, when Detective Rowan showed up on our doorstep again, only this time he wasn't calling. He was standing there in a gray windbreaker, hat in hand, looking like a man who'd already rehearsed the speech he didn't want to give. Tom opened the door, and the color drained out of his face so fast I thought he might hit the ground. He tried to slam the door shut, but Rowan wedged a boot in before it closed. "Tom," he said, calm, steady, practiced. "We need to talk." One of the witnesses finally came forward. Witness. That word hit the house like a damn grenade. I stepped into the hallway just as Rowan added, "You and the Mallory boy were seen fighting near the river. The statement is solid. You need to come in and answer a few questions." Tom's breathing went uneven, short, sharp, like each inhale was scraping his throat. "They're lying," he whispered. But the detective didn't back down. "Then come say that." When Rowan left, promising he'd be back soon, Tom slumped against the wall like the life had drained straight out of him. And something inside him cracked, just split open right there on our hardwood floor. He slid down until he was sitting with his back against the plaster, hands shaking, eyes unfocused.
"Mary," he said, voice cracking, "I can't do this again."
Again. That word. I knelt down beside him, trying to stay steady even though my pulse was thundering in my ears. "Tell me what happened," I said quietly. "All of it. No more pieces." He stared at his hands, those same hands that had built our porch, fixed our sink, held me through grief and birthdays and bad nights, and he whispered, "I didn't push him first." First. My stomach twisted. He kept talking, words tumbling out like a man finally too tired to keep carrying the weight. Kevin made a comment about Clara. Said she was done with me, said I wasn't good enough for her. He'd been drinking, mouthing off, and I snapped. Jealousy. Just like Clara said. We fought, Tom continued. Not just shoving, real fighting. I hit him harder than I meant to. He stumbled back toward the bank. It was wet. Muddy. His foot slipped.
He fell sideways, hit his head on a rock.
His voice broke. He didn't get up. I felt cold all over, like the truth was sucking the heat out of my skin.
"And the others?"
I whispered. He nodded, eyes glassy. "They helped me. Told me we had to make it look like he wandered off drunk. Said the river would take care of it. Said no one would ever know. A pact. Boys making a deal with the devil. We swore never to talk," he said. "And we didn't. But the guilt." His breath hitched. "It never goes away, Mary. It never does." I should have said something. Asked questions. Comforted him. Condemned him. Something. But I just sat there feeling the walls of our life closing in around us. Because in one moment, one rush of words, the man I thought I knew dissolved, leaving behind someone I wasn't sure I recognized. The worst part, he wasn't asking me to understand. He wasn't asking me to forgive. He was asking me to help him lie. And the moment he looked into my eyes, pleading, desperate, terrified, I felt a sick, awful truth settle in my chest. Whatever choice I made next was going to ruin something. Either my marriage or my life. You ever sit across from someone you once loved with your whole life and suddenly realize you don't actually know who they are at all? That's how it felt when I finally walked into that visiting booth at the prison, still shaking from everything that had happened, still replaying the sound of my husband being taken away in handcuffs. He looked smaller somehow, like someone had drained the fight right out of him. No anger, no excuses, no rehearsed speech. Just a man who finally knew the truth had outrun him.
I sat down, and before I even touched the receiver, he whispered, "I never meant for any of this to touch you."
It was the first honest thing he'd said in years. And when I picked up the phone between us, he started talking like he had kept the words locked in a basement, the same way he once kept that duffel bag buried in ours. He told me the break in 20 years ago hadn't gone the way he remembered, or maybe he'd always remembered it right and just prayed the story would change with time. He said the boy he pushed wasn't supposed to hit that metal grate. He said he froze because he'd never hurt anyone before. Then he said the part that made my chest tighten. I ran because I didn't think anyone would believe me. And I stayed silent because I didn't want to lose the life we built. Hearing that shook me more than the confession itself.
Because all those years I spent carrying guilt about protecting him, all those nights staring at the hallway imagining that boy's mother waiting for a son who never came home, he had been carrying his own punishment in the form of a lie he could never set down. He said he tried to tell me 100 times, but every time he looked at me, he saw the woman who made him feel forgiven just by existing.
I didn't know what to say to that. Forgiveness isn't something you give automatically. It's something that grows or dies depending on what it's built on. And ours had been built on a hollow floorboard. He ended his confession with a question I still don't know how to answer. Did you stay silent because you loved me, or because you feared what telling the truth would make you become? I didn't answer. I just let the silence settle between us, heavier than any words I could have spoken. And as I walked out of that visiting room, Hearing the door lock behind me, I realized something I had avoided for nearly 2 decades. This story was no longer about protecting him. It was about deciding what kind of person I would be from this moment forward. And that decision was waiting for me the second I stepped outside. You ever try to avoid a truth for so long that when it finally stands in front of you, it feels like looking into a mirror you've been afraid to face? That's what it felt like the day I met the boy's mother. 20 years after the night everything happened, 20 years after her son never came home, 20 years after my husband buried the truth and I unknowingly helped keep it hidden. I didn't go looking for her. Life has a cruel way of placing people in your path exactly when you think you're done running. She was sitting alone on a bench outside the courthouse, clutching a worn file like it was the last thing tethering her to her own sanity. I recognized her from old photos I had seen in the news, eyes tired but sharp, like they'd memorized every face in the world hoping one of them would be her boy. I almost walked past her, telling myself I had no right to speak to her. But something, maybe guilt, maybe humanity, pulled me toward that. He was asking me to help him lie. And the moment he looked into my eyes, pleading, desperate, terrified, I felt a sick, awful truth settle in my chest. Whatever choice I made next was going to ruin something. Either my marriage or my life. You ever sit across from someone you once loved with your whole life and suddenly realize you don't actually know who they are at all? That's how it felt when I finally walked into that visiting booth at the prison, still shaking from everything that had happened, still replaying the sound of my husband being taken away in handcuffs. He looked smaller somehow, like someone had drained the fight right out of him. No anger, no excuses, no rehearsed speech. Just a man who finally knew the truth had outrun him. I sat down, and before I even touched the receiver, he whispered, "I never meant for any of this to touch you." It was the first honest thing he'd said in years. And when I picked up the phone between us, he started talking like he had kept the words locked in a basement, the same way he once kept that duffel bag buried in ours. He told me the break in 20 years ago hadn't gone the way he remembered, or maybe he'd always remembered it right and just prayed the story would change with time. He said the boy he pushed wasn't supposed to hit that metal grate. He said he froze because he'd never hurt anyone before. Then he said the part that made my chest tighten, I ran because I didn't think anyone would believe me. And I stayed silent because I didn't want to lose the life we built. Hearing that shook me more than the confession itself. Because all those years I spent carrying guilt about protecting him, all those nights staring at the hallway imagining that boy's mother waiting for a son who never came home, he had been carrying his own punishment in the form of a lie he could never set down. He said he tried to tell me 100 times, but every time he looked at me, he saw the woman who made him feel forgiven just by existing. I didn't know what to say to that. Forgiveness isn't something you give automatically. It's something that grows or dies depending on what it's built on. And ours had been built on a hollow floorboard. He ended his confession with a question I still don't know how to answer. Did you stay silent because you loved me, or because you feared what telling the truth would make you become? I didn't answer. I just let the silence settle between us, heavier than any words I could have spoken. And as I walked out of that visiting room, hearing the door lock behind me, I realized something I had avoided for nearly 2 decades. This story was no longer about protecting him. It was about deciding what kind of person I would be from this moment forward. And that decision was waiting for me the second I stepped outside. You ever try to avoid a truth for so long that when it finally stands in front of you, it feels like looking into a mirror you've been afraid to face? That's what it felt like the day I met the boy's mother. 20 years after the night everything happened, 20 years after her son never came home, 20 years after my husband buried the truth and I unknowingly helped keep it hidden. I didn't go looking for her. Life has a cruel way of placing people in your path exactly when you think you're done running. She was sitting alone on a bench outside the courthouse, clutching a worn file like it was the last thing tethering her to her own sanity. I recognized her from old photos I had seen in the news, eyes tired but sharp, like they'd memorized every face in the world hoping one of them would be her boy. I almost walked past her, telling myself I had no right to speak to her. But something, maybe guilt, maybe humanity, pulled me toward that. If this story stayed with you in any way, feel free to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I share these confessions because someone out there has lived a version of them, and maybe hearing it helps a little. Thanks for being here, and take care of yourself tonight.